following program on Ada Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we discuss the fundamental rights and human rights landscape in Sri Lanka. How have recent cases changed this landscape in Sri Lanka, and is it for the better or the worse? A very good evening, and thank you for taking the time to join us on yet another episode of Law, Land and Liberty, where we bring to you key legal concepts and break it down for the layman. Now, today's topic is something that you're not a stranger to if you've been following the show as of late, and that's on fundamental rights and human rights. Now, specifically this topic, we're reaching out to it again because of recent developments in the legal sphere that we've seen with new fundamental rights petitions come up, and also the human rights aspect when it comes to election years. But to speak about the more recent developments, we have with us someone that's very well suited for this topic and has quite a bit of experience, and that is Mr. Gamini Perera, attorney at law. So thank you very much for taking the time to actually speak to our viewers here today.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this program.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And a little bit of an introduction to Mr. Gamini Perera. He has 30 years of experience in the field of law, and he's also licensed in multiple other countries, including the bars in America and also in the UK. So safe to say we have a lot of insight and context that we can get out of him in this discussion. Now, before we go into the discussion, here is a little bit of a breakdown on how we're going to approach this topic. First, we'll be giving you a little bit of an introduction, not too deep, a surface level view into fundamental rights and human rights in Sri Lanka. Next, we'll be going into the current context in relation to the recent case filings and petitions. And finally, we'll be talking about the future of FR and HR in Sri Lanka. All right, well, without any further ado, let's get right into this topic. Of course, despite having covered it multiple times, there's always ever increasing pieces of information that floods these specific topics, and we always have to touch back every few months. So once again, sir, thank you very much for taking the time to actually update us and our viewers on this topic. Of course, before we get into any of the current specifics, I think it's important for us to get a little bit of an understanding and an introduction. And I believe it's best for us to start with the human rights in Sri Lanka. Yes. Could you give us a little bit of an overview?
Yes.
Sir?
This human rights in the world is the most essential part when it's come to the Sri Lankan situation, which is introduced in 1978 Constitution. So, Human Rights Charter, so everybody knows about the Universal Human Rights Charter. So it's a wide spectrum we have, and even the family rights. Now, for an example, its family right is not recognized in fundamental rights applications, so fundamental right area in Sri Lankan context, but human right is a very vast area. So the people's, the citizens, or the person's right, which has to be guaranteed by the governments and also recognized by the various government, is the human rights. So I think most of the human rights are aware by the in the people, citizens of any country, and therefore this aspect, the human right aspect, included in the Constitution of our country. So in 1978, from there onwards, Chapter 3 of the Constitution of Sri Lanka introduced the human rights into the fundamental rights. So someone can question what is the human rights and the fundamental rights. The human right is come from the Human Rights Charter, and each and every country, they decided what are the fundamental rights of the citizens. Now, if you go through the fundamental rights chapter, so there are two kind of applicants which they can seek any jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. That is, one is persons, the other one is citizens. So some fundamental rights are only for the citizens and some are for persons. Obviously, the persons, once you say persons, might be a legal person or natural person. So this is how it's come to the Constitution. So chapter 3 from Article 10 to 14, it's very clearly introduced the fundamental rights of the people. So this is the introduction that we could come into, and therefrom, so we will discuss further.
Exactly. So now that we have a little bit of an introduction on human rights and also fundamental rights and their involvement, I believe, a question of curiosity would be, apart from what's enshrined in the Constitution, what other legislatures or what other legal areas are there when it comes to the protection of human rights in Sri Lanka?
Right. It's a very valid question. Now, not only the Constitution, the constitutional rights will be exercised by the judicial. Judicial, especially the human rights or the fundamental rights jurisdiction conferred with the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. So Supreme Court has the sole power to look into the human rights violation and so on and so forth. So in that constitutional rights, that is Article 126 coupled with Article 17, any person or citizen appropriately can invoke the jurisdiction of Supreme Court. But the most important thing is we are wealth with most of the decided cases. So decided cases on fundamental rights enhance the spectrum of the fundamental rights area. So that is one of the area. Then the number 2 is some other cases in the world. Now, for an example, Indian constitutional rights in the fundamental rights area, and also various countries, maybe UK, maybe South Africa, and maybe USA. So these decisions of the Supreme Court and other jurisdiction, other courts at jurisdiction will have some kind of pressure or some kind of guidance to the Supreme Court of this country, and thereby this area is enhanced.
So it is enriched by practical applications of the law through case law as well. I think it's important now that you mentioned case law a little bit, sir. We would have to dive into the specific recent judgments as well. But before that, could you please give our viewers a little bit of an insight into some of the landmark cases that we may have seen in the landscape of human rights and fundamental rights in Sri Lanka? Not necessarily recent judgments that we have seen, but rather on the more historic fundamental ones.
Yes. Now we can understand most of the people are filing cases under the fundamental right jurisdiction. But in that, we always think if someone is violated administrative or executive action, then you can go to the fundamental right jurisdiction, invoking the fundamental right jurisdiction to Supreme Court. But on the other hand, even if there is any inaction on the part of the executive or the administrative action, that is not an action. Inaction can be considered as action. So a recent judgment, as you know well aware, the Easter bomb attack case. So that is filed against the persons who not acted. That's mean inaction. On the inaction, that is against, since judgment is already delivered, I can say that is against the former IGP and the Secretary of the Defense and the President and so on and so forth. So why they were named as respondent and why they were, the Supreme Court declared as they are responsible for this is because of their inaction. Now, most of the people think only the action can be challenged, but not only the action, even the inaction can be challenged. Now, for an example, in the recent judgment, that is in 2023 January, I think I can, my recollection. So that judgment, the 7-bench Supreme Court judges decided that the IGP, even though he got the information from the various sources, he didn't acted to prevent this, that much of tragedy. So that is an inaction. I think in this world, that's a remarkable case, because the number one person in the country, the president of the country, executive president, is held responsible. Then the IGP, Inspector General of Police, responsible for this matter, and also the Defense Secretary. So that is completely in relation to the national security. So you know very well, 270 people died and many hundred people were injured. So these are a kind of, I mean, if you see, if it is considered in the articles, there is no specific one that you can talk. But 12.1, the equal before the law, and at the same time, protection of the people is a fundamental right. Protection of any of the people, any of the persons in this country, and also, not only that, because of that incident, it took the entire economy going down, especially in the travel and tourism trade, and so on and so forth. So that is affected to the economic situation in the country. Why? The executives or the administratives not acted fairly and promptly, and what we expect from them. So these are the new development in the fundamental rights application, which has a landmark case and also which is an example all over the world.
Exactly. I think when you mentioned for it being a case to take an example of across the globe as a landmark case in order to hold the necessary people accountable, it's important for us to actually understand the evolution of fundamental rights and human rights in Sri Lanka as well, how we got to where we are in the current moment. If you could walk us through a little bit of that evolution so that we have a better understanding of just how much of a better position we're in at the current moment.
Yes. Now, there are very few articles, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14. If we very briefly says, 10 is right to think, right to believe, whatever. Then come to 11 is arbitrary, torture or whatever. Then 12 is equal before the law and protection before the law. Then 13, arrest, arbitrary assets, arrest, wrongful arrest. Then come to 14, your rights for living in somewhere, working there, very simply I say, the working right and so on and so forth. But at the same time, right to life, right to life is not included, not in the article. You can understand there is one parade in, that is in 2021 it seems, somewhere in some parade, so the police shooted and that person was, died. So in that case, so the heirs of the person who died filed a fundamental right application, and that was recognized as a violation of fundamental rights. So now, even though it is not incorporated into the Constitution, that you have many areas which is recognized by the Supreme Court in this country, and therefore the citizen of this country has better rights in the fundamental rights area, that is right to life. If you take Indian Constitution or Indian fundamental rights area, right to life is recognized there in black and white. But here, this was a further development made by the Honorable Supreme Court in this country. So therefore, I think that's a huge right of a people which is recognized by this country.
Exactly. We really do have to get into the specifics in relation to what you just mentioned, sir, the recent parade where we saw the shooting actually recognizing that there is a right to life that is, while not enshrined, still in action in Sri Lanka, especially when relating to the interaction of the Sri Lankan people and arms of the judiciary and also the police and law enforcement. How exactly does human rights evolve in that aspect, sir?
Yes, every people, every citizen has a right of fair hearing. That is number one. Divulged from that, every person, if the authority has any issue with him or her, so that the authority has to explain what is the reason for arrest. Now, for an example, law enforcement officers, law enforcement agencies. So, if they arrest the person who are being to arrest must understand what is the reason for arrest. So, this has been recognized by the Supreme Court. And we'll take as a very simple thing. Now, if you are asked to come to the police station, and if you were keep in a place where few hours without doing anything, and without let them to go out of the police, that is itself considered as an arrest. Some people doesn't know this, but anyway. So if someone slap you in the police station, a police officer or whoever, I mean the authorized person, so that is in fact recognized by Supreme Court. That's a cruelty. It's a cruelty. Only one slap. We don't care, the one slap. Sometimes we just forget about that. But if a person of law enforcement officers who slap were responsible for the violation of his fundamental rights, it comes under Article 11 cruelty. So these are judgments. There is a judgment from Justice Shirani Bandaranaike, Chief Justice, who decided one police officer just slapped one person and it is responsible for fundamental right violation. Therefore, there are many things in this country, even the promotions, the appointments, when we talk about the tender procedures, and many things are covered by the fundamental rights jurisdiction. These situations are day by day developed. Therefore, I think it's a matter that every citizen must understand what is the fundamental rights that they have.
In order for us to actually make use of the legislature that's trying to protect us, we need to first understand and educate ourselves on how exactly it functions. I believe we have a lot more to discuss when it comes to the current context as well, and also about maybe some malicious proceedings that we have seen in recent events and how we're not supposed to be misusing the rights that have been given to us. But before we get into any of these specifics, let's go in for a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We're in conversation with Mr. Gamini Perera, attorney at law, and we were talking about the very basics of human rights and fundamental rights. And I believe we covered quite a bit when it comes to fundamental rights in Sri Lanka. But I think we have to put a little bit more focus on the human rights aspect as well, and that is specifically when it comes to organizations that are in place when it comes to the protection of human rights in Sri Lanka. Could you please give us a little bit of an overview into the Human Rights Commission in Sri Lanka and how exactly it works towards the protection of human rights?
In the human rights sector, the Human Rights Commission is one of the another organization that's looking into the violation of the fundamental rights and fundamental rights. So basically, it's called human rights. I already explained you, the fundamental rights comes under the human rights. So the human rights commissions are all over the world. And Sri Lanka, we have Human Rights Commission. It is an independent body. No one can interfere with them. So if a person has any grievance of violation of his fundamental rights by the executive or the administrative action or inaction, so you can go to Supreme Court, or either you can go to Human Rights Commission. And also, if you go to the Human Rights Commission within the specific period, so you have the liberty to go to the Supreme Court as well. So then, if you now the situation is there is a time factor, right? To file a fundamental right application, you have to go before the Supreme Court within 1 month of your violation of your rights, or you can go imminent infringement of your rights. Then that's 1 month is not counted. The other way, if you cannot file a fundamental right application in the Supreme Court within the 1 month, then you can go to the Human Rights Commission within 3 months of the violation of your rights. So in that sense, the Human Rights Commission gives you more room to seek remedies. Then how the Human Rights Commission in this country works? What is the actual spectrum of what is the actual limitations of the Human Rights Commission? So you can complain to the human rights very simply. Now, if you are going to the Supreme Court, one will say you have to spend much of, for the lawyers' fees and many other costs involved. But when you go to the Human Rights Commission, you can just write a letter to them saying what is your grievance, what is your problem. Even if you can't go there, if you can't, go and complain there, so you can just write a letter addressed to the Human Rights Commission. And even if you can't write a letter, you can just call them. There is a number, you can call them and say that I was treated illegally under the human rights aspect. Therefore, there are many flexibility to complain to the Human Rights Commission, and they will acknowledge those complaints, that is by mail, by fax, by in writing a letter, then calling, then going to the Human Rights Commission and make the complaint. So then they will call the observation if there is a prima facie matter. Prima facie is very well. If there is on the face of it, if there is a case, right, to look into, then Human Rights Commission will call for observation of the respondents. Now, comparatively, in the Supreme Court, if you file a fundamental right application, you have to support it. You have to support for leave to proceed. What do you mean by leave to proceed? Since you are also in the legal fraternity now, so it is the Supreme Court has to look into that to see whether there is a case to be heard. If it is only, the Supreme Court issue notice on the respondents. But in the Human Rights Commission, there is no such supporting event, but the Human Rights Commission itself consider whether there is any violation of fundamental rights as of it. Then they issue notice to the other party and come to the Human Rights Commission and give their explanation, and then have an inquiry, and they decided whether this is a fit and proper case to recommend whatever the things. Now, mostly they are not giving the compensation, but they say now, for an example, if there is any arbitrary decision to promote someone, any arbitrary decision to not consider someone to the proper position, so then they will make representation to the relevant authorities to correct it. Right? So this is how Human Rights Commission works. So then there are some other avenues, right? So even in the human right aspect, the fundamental right is something, and the human right aspect, so if you have any kind of arbitrary decision or the illegal decision by the executive or administrative and rather from the government wing, then you have the writ jurisdiction. No one will consider it. Generally, writ jurisdiction is also a human rights. Now, for an example, if a person is kept in remand or kept in custody, not in remand, custody, without informing courts, without obtaining any permission from the authorities like in a detention order, so then you may be heard about the writ habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is if someone is kept someone in a dark, right, without informing any authorities, then a citizen can file a habeas corpus writ application. That jurisdiction given to the Court of Appeal. So that is also one of the human right aspect. Habeas corpus, even writ application, there are few writ applications, certiorari, mandamus, all these comes under the human rights of the citizen or the person whom are subject to fair opportunities. So this is also one of the human rights aspect, and one is Supreme Court, then number 2 is Human Rights Commission, and number 3 is writ jurisdiction. So these are the main things in this country. The human rights are endorsed.
Exactly. So I think the awareness that there are certain other pieces of legislature that actually look out for human rights and fundamental rights in Sri Lanka would give way to the question of asking how other pieces of legislature could be interacting with the existing landscape for human rights and fundamental rights in Sri Lanka. For example, like the Right to Information Act and other related acts as well. How does these legislatures actually mingle with our human rights landscape in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, that is also one of the aspects, the enhance of the human rights angle. Now, Right to Information Act, as you said, Right to Information Act gives you, as a citizen of this country, to know what exactly happening in relation to you. Now, every authority, we call authority, right? Every government authority must adhere to the Right to Information Act. Now, recent development, I can tell you, now every institution of the government must have an information officer, right? So, if you need any kind of information, you have to write them. There is a specific form that you can use it, or otherwise it's not a matter. You can write to them, and within 14 days of the receipt of that, so that authority must inform whatever the information that they requested. So this is a right of information. It's a fundamental right in the other way. So if you get the information request, so the authority must confirm that the acknowledgement. That is number 1. Number 2, then they have to supply the information within 14 days. If you are failed to do so, the authority, then you have a commission, that is Right to Information Commission. You can go to that commission, and that commission will look into the matter, and then they will decide whether this information to be delivered. In this area, there is a new development. I was a member of the committee, that is why I can tell that. So even the cabinet of Sri Lanka is subject to deliver the right to information. There are two things, cabinet and the cabinet office. Cabinet is one authority and cabinet office is another authority. So therefore, if the cabinet memorandum is passed, cabinet memorandum is passed by the cabinet, that means cabinet decision. So you are entitled to obtain the cabinet decision, right? If the ministers, any ministry has decided something, then you are entitled to that decision to be known. Now, there are some restrictions. Fair enough to have those restrictions. Now, if I ask something about you, without your consent, the public authority would not divulge those information to the other. Because it is very, very fair, I think, because if it is a personal one, if it's a national, affecting to the national security, or something like that, there are few areas. Otherwise, the citizens are entitled to obtain the information from the government authorities. So this is another sector that was introduced not recently, some years back, but now it is well-strengthened area, and I saw most of the people are utilizing this for some other legal purposes.
Exactly. I think that's a very good point that you touched on in the final bit. So when it comes to the actual utilization of the rights that have been bestowed upon us and the rights that we are entitled to, there is a little bit of a malicious concept as well, where there is some form of ways to actually misuse the rights given to us. But before we get into any of the specifics, and we also have to speak about how certain tragedies like the COVID pandemic also may have developed a little bit of our human rights and fundamental rights landscape here in Sri Lanka. Before we get into any of those specifics, let's go in for a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We're in our final segment with Mr. Gamini, Perera, attorney at law. So once again, we just got done with a very heavy segment. I believe there's a lot of information to unpack when it comes to actually the updates and also the recent legislature and how fundamental rights and human rights actually interact with other pieces of legislature in Sri Lanka. I think just before we went off to the break, we had a little bit of a peek into exactly why we shouldn't be misusing certain pieces of legislation that have been bestowed to us. If you could, sir, explain to us exactly what the repercussions could be when it comes to the misuse of the rights.
Yeah. Now, so when we invoke the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, we obviously know that we have to stick to the fundamental rights that is prima facie, or at the glance, if it is a matter where that the fundamental rights are violated. So the violation of fundamental rights are obviously we can understand, but the application to the Supreme Court are made by two ways. This has to be known by the people. One is you can yourself write to the Supreme Court. There is no necessity of lawyers. You can write to the Supreme Court. Even in a piece of paper, you can write to the Supreme Court, and that will be looked into. Then number two, the a person can retain a lawyer, and through a lawyer you can file a fundamental right application. Then when it's come to the lawyer's aspect, whatever your client or the person who claim to be aggrieved say that cannot be considered always for a fundamental right application. Therefore, a lawyer, a person who is going before the Supreme Court, has a huge duty, a very wide range of duty cast on that person to see whether there is a fundamental rights violation. If it is not, that is, we call abuse of the system. We can see there are many instances that the Supreme Court has made remarkable notes on this. Even the lawyers who appeared, and sometimes the Supreme Court has ordered costs. Cost is now not a, in Supreme Court you don't get sentence, you don't get penalty in that sense, but this cost is a kind of a notice that you have done a wrong thing in this. The court freezes time, and the other party's lawyers freezes time, and everything will be affected. And also the large, the people of the country may have not recognized, or they will get confused what are the fundamental rights. So now for an example, the recent application which is decided, therefore we are entitled to talk about this, the recent application regarding the presidential election, and one of the litigant, he requested the Supreme Court to grant leave to proceed, and until such time stop the presidential election to be declared by the commission, election commission, right? That was, the Supreme Court has decided it is completely wrong. There is no merit, there is no prima facie case, on the face of it there is no case, and that was dismissed at the inception, and also awarded 100,000 rupees as a cost. So after that, there is another lawyer, that's a law student, the earlier one, then another lawyer very recently, 2 days before, argued in a matter in the Supreme Court, and His Lordship Chief Justice thoroughly warned the particular lawyer not to abuse this system. So my understanding is, my point of view is, we being the lawyers, we have a prime duty towards the society, towards the Supreme Court or any other courts, and also towards our client. If a client just say this is a violation of fundamental rights, first of all, you have to satisfy whether there is a violation. If you are not satisfied, how can the other party or their lordship's court satisfy? Therefore, if you misuse, if you file any frivolous application in the Supreme Court, I think that is abusing of this noble rights of a person. So it is a duty of everybody, not only the lawyers, everybody must understand whether this is a fit and proper case to go before the apex court, and using the precious time of the Supreme Court, and also a huge sum of money involved for all these administrative matters. Therefore, that is also one of the aspects. So I think now the first one is only 100,000 rupees, and the second one 500,000 rupees. One can argue that it is not enough, but anyway, the Supreme Court has stepped into this area, and now the next one, the Supreme Court will decide more than the amount that they have already ordered. Therefore, everybody must understand, this is not this cannot be taken as a granted to file application, but it has to be a matter that you can utilize for the benefit of the people, at the same time having a truthful and real grievance if you have. So this is the area that Supreme Court has now developed. If someone is filing a wrong kind of application, the repercussions are as such.
Exactly. So I think it's very important for us to actually understand the fact that we have seen the Supreme Court take such action on the actions of members of the general public when it comes to the entitlement of fundamental rights. So how exactly would you predict, or how, in your opinion, where do you see the future of Sri Lanka's human rights landscape and fundamental rights landscape developing?
Yeah, now we understand every day there is a development. There is a development in this sector. Their lordships judges look into these matters very kindly, very broadly. I mean, although having tired of these kind of cases, having very limited time for these things, and having huge sum of case files, but the Supreme Court, their lordships courts are very kind enough to look into these matters towards the people's, to guarantee the people's right. Therefore, I think the future in this country, in the, as you said, the landscape of the fundamental rights and the human rights will be definitely enhanced. Definitely enhanced. The judiciary is independent. Therefore, every citizen of this country can invoke, if there is any fundamental right violation, before the Supreme Court jurisdiction, and they have the guarantee that the Supreme Court will look into this matter. Therefore, I think the people of this country can have a better future in this area. One more thing. Now there are many acts passed by the Parliament recently, and those you may note about that. The social media, if someone is going to misuse social media and someone is trying to make hate speech, some in case against the women, there are many acts passed by the Parliament. So that is the legislature. So legislature also recognize the rights of the people. I think it's more than before. Therefore, the rights of the people are guaranteed. In the future, there are many things. Now, for an example, if we come to the election, now what the people, what those petitioners trying to do is to prevent the having presidential election within the time. So that's a fundamental right of the people to have a proper election and their vote for the voting rights. Therefore, every aspect of this country now it is focusing to enhance, to widen the spectrum in the human rights and the fundamental rights landscape.
Right. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, sir, our time here today has come to an end. Thank you once again, sir, for actually explaining to our audience and actually enlightening us on how exactly fundamental rights exist and how it will progress in the future to exactly ensure that we will not have anything to worry about when it comes to the progression of fundamental rights.
So, thank you very much. I invite everybody to contribute to uphold the fundamental rights and the human rights in this country. Thank you.
All right, well, this discussion should cause you to understand that fundamental rights and human rights, while existing and entitled to us, should not be something that we use and misuse and abuse in order to gain malicious benefits. We leave you tonight with the words of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. We will not enjoy security without development, we will not enjoy development without security, and we will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. That is all we have for you tonight on Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed any of today's programs, you can always rewatch by catching us on our YouTube page, youtube.com/otherderana English. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good night.